In a crowded courtroom in Houston, Texas, the atmosphere was thick with quiet anticipation and subtle judgment. At the defense table stood Kevin Brooks, a 19-year-old black teenager, wearing a plain button-down shirt and dark slacks, his hands tucked into his pockets, his posture upright but calm. Charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest, Kevin faced more than just criminal accusations. From the moment he entered the courtroom, it was clear that this was not going to be a fair fight. Judge Raymond Ellis, a man known for his impatience and fondness for golf, leaned back in his chair and glanced at Kevin over the rim of his glasses with an expression that blended amusement with condescension. "Let's make this quick," he muttered, flipping open the case file. "I've got a tea time at 2. The courtroom chuckled. Bailiff, stenographer, even the prosecutor. To them, this wasn't a serious case. It was routine. Another troubled teen who'd probably made a string of bad choices. Another open and shut conviction that wouldn't require much thought. But Kevin didn't smile. He didn't fidget or look away. He simply stood his ground, silently absorbing every sneer and sideways glance. What none of them knew, what none of them even imagined, was that Kevin had spent years preparing for this. Not for this exact moment, perhaps, but for one just like it. While other kids his age obsessed over video games or sports stats, Kevin studied trial law. He devoured legal textbooks his mother brought home from work as a former court clerk. He watched court hearings on public access channels and reenacted cross-examinations in his room. He knew what made a witness crumble under questioning. He knew what evidence could be discredited. And he knew that no one in that courtroom was expecting any of it from him. Judge Ellis, peering down from the bench, assumed he was dealing with a lost cause. He saw Kevin's youth and skin color before he saw the human being behind them. His sigh, his jokes, even the way he held the file, all pointed to a decision made before the trial even began. That was the first mistake. The second came when the prosecutor, confident and self-assured, began his opening argument with a voice full of conviction and bias. He painted Kevin as a criminal, a runner, a kid caught red-handed in a stolen 2022 Audi. But appearances can lie, and assumptions, especially the kind based on bias, are often dead wrong. Kevin stood in silence through it all, watching carefully, knowing his moment would come. He wasn't just defending himself from the charges. He was defending himself from a system that had never expected him to speak, much less to speak with power. And while Judge Ellis couldn't see it yet, the trial he thought would be over before lunch was about to turn into the most unforgettable moment of his career. The room fell into stunned silence when Kevin Brooks calmly stood and announced, "Your Honor, I'll be representing myself." Gasps rippled through the gallery, and even the court clerk looked up in surprise. Judge Ellis raised an eyebrow, visibly amused. "You'll what?" he asked, barely suppressing a smirk. "I'll be defending myself, sir," Kevin repeated, his voice steady. Laughter buzzed softly through the room. The prosecutor, Thomas Ridley, chuckled and shook his head as if the outcome had already been sealed. But when Kevin took his first slow, confident step toward the podium, the mood began to shift. He adjusted his collar and let the silence settle before speaking. "Before I begin, Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to confirm a point made by the prosecution." He turned to Ridley. "You stated Officer Grant personally saw me behind the wheel of the vehicle before I fled, correct?" Ridley nodded, dismissive. "That's what the officer's report says." Kevin paused, then turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony." "On what grounds?" Judge Ellis asked, more curious than annoyed. Kevin replied, "Because Officer Grant wasn't on duty at the time of the incident. His report claims he witnessed the arrest, but GPS logs will show otherwise." The courtroom stirred. Even Ridley blinked, caught off guard. Kevin continued, "I'd like the court to subpoena Officer Grant's duty records and GPS data. If he was telling the truth, the records will confirm it." But if he wasn't, the silence that followed wasn't just stunned, it was uneasy. For the first time, the jury leaned forward, curious. Ridley's confidence faltered. "We're taking a defendant's word over an officer's now?" He tried to recover. Kevin shrugged slightly. "Truth is truth, no matter who speaks it." Then he pivoted. "Let's talk about the fingerprints," he said. "Yes, mine were found on the steering wheel. But let me ask you, if you try on a pair of shoes at a store and walk away and someone else steals them later, are you guilty just because your prints are there?" Several jurors exchanged glances. Kevin went on to explain that he had leaned into the unlocked car out of curiosity, hours before it was stolen, while walking home from a convenience store with friends. "Touching something isn't stealing it," he said quietly. Finally, Kevin delivered the turning point. "This," he said, holding up a document, "is the original police report from the vehicle's owner, Mr. Glenn Stanton. He told officers the suspect was white." Audible gasps filled the room. "That detail," Kevin said, "was conveniently left out of the prosecution's file." From that moment on, the tide turned. The judge shifted in his seat. Ridley stopped flipping papers. The jury's expressions transformed from skepticism to concern. Kevin wasn't just dismantling their case, he was exposing the carelessness of a system that had nearly condemned him without a full picture. And for the first time, everyone in that courtroom saw Kevin Brooks not as a defendant, but as a young man who demanded to be heard, and who knew exactly how to make them listen. The courtroom, which had been filled with quiet confidence from the prosecution's side, slowly began to shift in atmosphere. Kevin Brooks, just 20 years old, stood alone at the defense table. No suit, no law degree, just conviction, and a stack of papers he'd spent countless nights poring over. "Your Honor," Kevin said, voice steady, "before I continue, I'd like to call attention to something crucial." He lifted one of the reports high enough for the judge, jury, and the gallery to see. "This is the original police report filed by the arresting officer. But there's something missing here, something important." Prosecutor Thomas Ridley rolled his eyes. "The report is complete. It's been reviewed." Kevin cut in, respectfully but firmly. "Is it? Because the owner of the vehicle, Mr. Glenn Stanton, gave a statement that night which is nowhere in this file." The judge leaned forward slightly. "What kind of statement?" Kevin turned to the jury. "Mr. Stanton told police he saw the suspect who stole his car, and that the suspect was white." The room went still. Kevin continued, "I am not white, and yet that description was never passed to the press, never presented in the prosecution's documents, and conveniently never brought up today." You could feel the tension thicken in the room. The jury's posture changed, arms uncrossed, eyes sharpened. They were listening, really listening now. Ridley stepped forward, flustered. "That's irrelevant. The defendant was found near the scene of the crime. His fingerprints were on the steering wheel." Kevin nodded calmly. "Yes. And I already admitted to touching the car earlier that day. It was parked outside a corner store, door unlocked. I was with friends. I leaned in out of curiosity, didn't take anything, didn't drive it. That was hours before it was stolen." He paused, then asked the jury directly, "Does that make me a thief? Or does it make me a young man guilty of a poor decision, not a crime?" Then he looked back at the judge. "And as for the officer who claimed to see me behind the wheel, his GPS logs place him on the other side of town at the time of the chase. That's not my opinion. That's data." Ridley's face flushed. The jury, now visibly concerned. Judge Ellis adjusted his glasses and glanced back at the prosecution. "Counselor, do you have an explanation for the missing statement and this apparent contradiction?" But Ridley had no answer. Kevin stood tall, voice unwavering. "This case isn't about justice. It's about convenience, about fitting someone into a story that was never complete to begin with. but I won't let that be me." And just like that, a courtroom that had once dismissed him as just another lost kid now watched him with something else in their eyes: respect. The courtroom had been tense for over an hour, but when Kevin Brooks slowly stepped forward holding a folded piece of paper, the air changed. It wasn't just the anticipation of his next move. It was the calm confidence in his stride, the way he stood, shoulders squared, gaze steady. "Your Honor," Kevin said, unfolding the paper with deliberate care, "I would like to submit this into evidence. It's a copy of the original police report, taken the night Mr. Stanton's car was stolen." Judge Ellis motioned for him to proceed. Prosecutor Thomas Ridley watched with arms crossed, already preparing to dismiss whatever came next. Kevin continued, his voice clear. "In that report, Mr. Stanton, the registered owner of the vehicle, made a statement to officers. He said he saw the person who stole his car." Kevin paused, letting the weight of that line settle. "And he said the suspect was white." The gallery gasped. The judge leaned forward. Ridley shifted uncomfortably. Kevin held up the transcript. That statement was recorded, filed, but somehow never made it into the prosecution's documentation, never presented in court, never mentioned, until now. He turned to face the jury, his voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, how can I be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt when the first person who witnessed the crime described someone who doesn't look like me?" For the first time all day, the room fell silent. Not just still, but stunned. You could hear a pin drop. Ridley scrambled. "Your Honor, the defendant was found near the scene. His prints were on the steering wheel." "And I've already explained that," Kevin said, his voice calm but cutting. "I touched the car earlier in the day. I was outside the gas station. The door was open. I was curious. I looked inside, then walked away. No crime, no theft, just fingerprints." He looked at the jury again. "If you tried on a coat in a store and it was later stolen, would that make you a thief? Or just someone who touched it first?" Even the judge looked shaken now. Kevin turned back to Ridley. "You built this case on shaky ground, ignored witness statements, failed to subpoena the forensic specialist, relied on assumptions, not facts. And the facts? They don't point to me." The silence was no longer just shock. It was realization. Kevin took a breath. "This wasn't a fair trial from the start, but I made sure it became one." He returned to his table. Judge Ellis stared at him for a long moment before finally turning to the prosecutor. "Does the state wish to proceed?" Ridley, visibly deflated, shook his head. "No, Your Honor." The gavel struck. Case dismissed. As Kevin stepped out of the courtroom, reporters clamoring, spectators whispering, and the judge watching him with something close to respect, he didn't smile. He just walked tall. Because it was never about winning. It was about telling the truth and making them listen. There's something about quiet strength that leaves a mark. And that's exactly what Jaylen Walker carried with him that day. At just 19 years old, Jaylen found himself standing in a courtroom where most people had already made up their minds. To them, he was just another kid in trouble, accused of grand theft auto, suspected of fleeing from the police. The judge, Mr. Harold Grayson, looked at him with the kind of disinterest reserved for cases that were already decided in his head. But what he didn't realize was that the young man before him wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was something different, something prepared. Jaylen's voice was calm when he said the words that changed everything. "Your Honor, I'll be representing myself." The room froze. A teenager facing serious charges, stepping up to defend his own name? Most saw it as foolish. The judge smirked. The prosecutor chuckled, but Jaylen didn't flinch. He began asking questions, smart ones, pointed ones, questions that poked holes in the so-called evidence. The officer who claimed to have seen Jalen in the stolen vehicle? Jalen calmly requested that the court pull GPS records, revealing that the officer wasn't even on duty when the chase began. The courtroom stirred. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Next, Jalen brought up the fingerprints. "Does touching something make you a criminal?" he asked the jury. He explained that he had briefly opened the unlocked door of the car hours before it was reported stolen. A dumb moment, sure, but not theft. And then came the moment that silenced everyone. Jalen pulled out a copy of the original police report, something the prosecution had forgotten to include. It contained a witness statement from the car's owner, who clearly said the person who stole his car was white. Jalen, of course, was not. The courtroom gasped. Even the judge shifted in his seat, the weight of the truth finally landing. By the end of the hearing, everything had changed. What started as a presumed conviction had become a lesson in justice, bias, and the power of knowledge. When the judge finally dismissed the case, he looked at Jalen and said something no one expected. "You should consider law school." And Jalen? He just smiled, because he already had. The story of Jalen Walker reminds us that wisdom isn't measured by age, and justice isn't always served by those in charge. It's upheld by those brave enough to speak truth, even when the odds are stacked against them. For older adults, many of whom have witnessed decades of social change, this story echoes a deeper truth. Assumptions can be dangerous, and silence can allow injustice to thrive. Jalen's calm, informed defense didn't just protect himself. It held a mirror to a system too comfortable with rushing to judgment. In our daily lives, this reminds us that it's never too late to stand up when something feels wrong, and never too old to believe in fairness. Whether you're speaking out in your community, guiding your grandchildren, or simply choosing to listen more openly, the principle holds: truth, when spoken with courage and grace, still has the power to change hearts and systems. Let this story remind us that justice isn't a fixed destination. It's a path we walk every day, through awareness, empathy, and action. And sometimes all it takes is one voice, clear and steady, to lead the way forward.